Some people really don't know how to produce anything, so they don't have much credit. Others have great capacity. So let's forget about financial credit and look at real credit. And I've put there real credit equals productive capacity. That's the capacity of those people to produce the things that they want. And that is made up of a number of different things, which I've listed under various headings, as you can see. And the first thing is, before any group of people, before any nation can produce anything, they've got to have something to start with. You couldn't go right out into the middle of space and start producing things, because all you've got around you is space. So I've listed under heading 1 the simplest, most basic things that any of us could think of. Earth, the source of our food. It transforms seeds into life, plants. In fact, really, it's the bed of all production, if you like. Air that we breathe. Without air, of course, we couldn't live. Water, which again is absolutely essential to life. We don't last too long without water. Minerals that we shape into the various tools that we use. And solar energy. And solar energy in a wider sense than just sunbeams. Sunbeams is the start, but sunbeams are then locked into various types of energy, like, for example, petroleum or coal, all of which really is trapped sunbeams. We call it solar energy. Locked into fossil fuels, just trapped in there, and then mankind can use it. And you look at that list first of all, and you just look along it, and you'd have to ask the question, how much of that was created by man? Quite obviously none of it. Who created it then? Well, Christians don't even have to think about that. They know very well this was created by God and was given to man. Now, this sounds absolutely trite, doesn't it? Most people know that. Little children would know this. And yet, do you know that once you've accepted that, you have taken a giant stride away from every type of economic teaching in any university in the world at the present time? Because every university teaches that labor produces all wealth. And we have what is called the labor theory of value. The labor theory of value is taken as a divine principle in the law of economics. Labor produces all wealth. Well, how much of that was produced by labor? None of it. It was produced and created by God and given to man for nothing. We didn't have to pay hire purchase to get that. We didn't have to go and sign a contract. We were given a huge area of wealth for nothing, which strikes a second deadly blow at economics taught around the world, which is that you never get anything for nothing. Well, we started off pretty well. God gave us a vast area of capital, physical capital, to his children and said, this is for you. You are to take dominion over that. You're to use it properly, husband it. That's where we get the word husbandry from. And for a long time, man lived in an environment that had all these things that God had given us, and we didn't really know how to use it. So our economic systems were the most primitive things. You can read it in the Old Testament. Simple tribes that just herded cattle on hillsides. You can still see many nations in the world that live at that level of economy. Subsistence. Sometimes they eat berries out of the forest, shoot an animal. Their whole economic system, their productive system, is a terrific struggle just to extract life out of what God has given us. But you see, inherent in what God had given us was also this thing, which we've developed in the previous lectures, that if you discover truth, it makes life better for you. And man began to discover ways to use this beautiful capital that God had given us. He discovered something called a wheel. Now, he didn't really invent it. He merely discovered a natural law that was there. Wheels turn, they're round, you can shift things with them. You can even ride on them. And as soon as he discovered that wheel, his real credit grew a little bit. He discovered something called a lever. You can get a lever and put it over a fulcrum, and you can get on the end and you can shift a weight you couldn't shift with your muscles. Now, he didn't actually create the lever. He simply discovered that by putting two things together, you'd stumbled on part of God's law, and it made things easier. And he began to bank this knowledge of how to use the environment into his mind and then to pass it on to his children. You see, once the wheel had been discovered, we didn't have to keep discovering it every generation. Fathers told sons, and sons had that knowledge for nothing. So as God gave people something for nothing, we in turn, having discovered how to use this, then passed it on to our children for nothing. We had a mechanism to do this, which we call our educational system. And the educational system is supposed to be a mechanism to keep passing on to those who come after us what we have learnt about the environment that God has given us. Not just in production, but in every sphere of human activity. And this bank of knowledge that we've got, we call our cultural heritage. The Americans call it know-how, which perhaps is more graphic. You just keep passing your know-how on, and each generation gets something for nothing. Now, it's quite possible for a generation to come along which says, this cultural heritage, you know, is just a waste of time. Why bother to pick it up? Why bother to learn it? And you can have a bank of knowledge which has taken 1,000 years to build up, destroyed in one generation. And what happens to that civilization? They go right back to square one, and it might take them another 1,000 years to build up the same cultural heritage that the previous civilization might have had. You lose the whole thing just by disobedience or neglect or pride. But provided you use the cultural heritage which you've been given correctly, how to use what God has given us, certainly in a productive sense, it enables a number of great benefits or increments to come flowing through. And in a productive sense, every time we discover a way of making advances, doing things easier, learning how to use our environment, we can translate that into one of two fields. Either we can continue to increase production, or else, as we've discovered a way to make it easier, we can have more leisure. We can have our Sundays off. Don't have to work on those days. You could even have Saturday afternoons off. And I would put it to you, again, right against everything that is taught, that what we call the greatest progress, if we're going to use that word civilization, comes out of leisure and not out of work. I'm really challenging a few sacred cows, no doubt. People say leisure instead of work. Well, you can test it. Go and have a look at societies that have no leisure at all. They're the most brutalized type of societies that you'll ever find. You can think of a number of examples. I spent nearly all my life in Africa, and you can see many people there who have no leisure. I can think of one tribe in the Kalahari Desert. They'd be the hardest working people on earth. Their economic system simply evolves around getting up as the sun comes up, going off hunting, perhaps going 30, 40 miles. If they're very lucky, they find an animal, shoot it, drag it back home, absolutely exhausted, put it in a cooking pot, eat it, and that gives them the strength the next day to get up and do the same thing. And if you don't do it, you go hungry. So they are absolutely like on a treadmill, if you like, just to keep going. And there is a society without any music, without any art, without any history, without any dream time, without any culture, without pictures, without faith. And they could be like that for another 1,000 years until they simply discover one little new facet about God's creation which might break them out. Perhaps just a new weapon to shoot that animal, I don't know. Perhaps the fact that you can plant seeds in the ground and make it grow into food. You can go and have a look at communist societies. The one thing the communist society says is no leisure. Full employment for everybody, 7 days a week, including wives. And one of the most remarkable things that people come back from a trip through Russia and they say 11 o'clock at night you see old women running concrete machines and sweeping the streets. There's a brutalized society. But as against that, go back into periods in our own history as we developed a very dim understanding of how to use our environment in a Christian way. And one of the most interesting periods is right back in the 1200s, the same period that produced Magna Carta, when although they'd never heard of motor cars and televisions and all the gadgets that clutter up our society today, for what they needed, they had a good productive system. Their food, their clothing, their shelter, their simple needs. And the result of this was that the average family in England, and not only England, but really right through parts of Europe, between 12 and 1300 were working 16 weeks of the year. 16 weeks of the year. And here we are arguing about a 35-hour week as though the end of the world had come. The church, which was very strong, decreed 150 holidays a year. 150 holidays a year. They were called holy days. That's where the word came from. And there was a special saint for each day. And you go through the old church calendars and look at the saints' days, you'd have a job remembering how many there were. And on those days you didn't work. Well, what on earth did people do with 150 holidays a year? Did they all go down to the pub and get absolutely blind drunk, or on drugs, or get on motorbikes and go screeching around the streets? Or they translated that enormous leisure period into the greatest explosion of culture. They spiritualized their lives that we've probably ever seen. It's about the last asset that Britain has got left. In a period of 97 years, they built 48 of the most beautiful cathedrals that mankind has ever seen. And they were built in spare time as a leisure activity. And you go into cathedrals like Westminster Abbey or Canterbury Cathedral, Exeter, Wells, Norwich, right up and down the length and land of Britain. You walk into buildings that are out of this world. 600 or 700 feet long, 300 feet tall, and the thing that hits you is the almost excruciating amount of detail and care and love that went into building those. Minute carvings. We couldn't do it today. There's not one machine, there's not one engineer, there's not one architect could even approach it. All done with simple hand tools. First one that was ever built was Notre Dame Cathedral in France. They had 2,500 volunteers working on that cathedral every day for 80 years. How's that? And you come outside and you see scratched into the old stonework, "To the greater glory of God." There were no strikes, no overtime, no bosses, no union officials, none of the nonsense that we've got today. People just got together after the food and the housekeeping and the living side of life was concerned and said, well, what are we going to do? Let's build the most beautiful thing we can do up on the hill there. And away they'd go for 80 years. It wasn't only in the field of the church. Their cottages, many of them are standing today. When you built a home there, you didn't build it for 60 years, you built it for 800. Little cottages right up and down Britain. Those marvelous villages, guild halls, where they used to hold their civic functions, their markets. Nearly everybody plays a musical instrument. You're an absolute none if you didn't play something or other. Terrific amount of drama. There was really no barrier between the church and the state. If you had a great problem in your village, you took it into the church. And people used to sit around in the church and discuss philosophical questions and political questions and how should we run the nation. And that's how Magna Carta really was a Christian document. It was the product really of the church, even though it applied to the state. And people call that period Merry England. Merry England. There's a nice ring about that. And it flowed through to the 1400s and the 1500s, and it began to throw up individuals who had a tremendous personal development of genius, which comes out of a type of field that is nurtured in a certain type of way. People like Shakespeare and Bacon, the father of deductive science. And then gradually men lost the vision. The next great discovery under heading 3 there was something called the division of labor. Now, up until that time, everything had been done on a very simple cottage industry basis. One man was a thatcher. He thatched roofs on cottages. One man was a man who put shoes on horses. One man was a clothier and made coats out of... Everything was done on an individual, simple cottage industry basis. One man was the baker who made homemade loaves. One man might make nails for building, and they had very primitive nails, and he used to sit down in his village with a little forge in front of him, and he'd draw bars of iron into the right length with a hammer and a forge, and then he'd put a point on one end and a flathead on the other end and pack them into little baskets. And working under that system day after day, he might produce 50 nails a day. And then he discovered that if you sat 4 people down in a line and each person took part of the process, one heated the iron, the next one put the points on, the next man put the flatheads on, the next man packed them into their little rush baskets, that without any extra effort, production now increased to 150 nails per person instead of 50. There was a new extra bonus that came without effort simply by discovering correct principles. And that was the forerunner of huge industrial lines that really have taken it too far today. Well, you might see a car going right through a factory, and each person just does one thing. You just spend your life putting a bolt on, or a steering wheel on, or painting it, or whatever. And because that endless belt is so long and there are so many things coming off it, they all begin to look exactly the same. I think the first one that really hit the world was Henry Ford and his Model T car that came, I think a million came off an endless belt back in 1916. So many of them, and that Henry Ford coined that famous phrase that if you wanted a Model T Ford, you could have any color you wanted so long as it was black. But really, if you think about it, that discovery should have knocked that 16 weeks of the year down to 13 weeks of the year, or perhaps 12. And then all of a sudden man discovered the most incredible thing of all, this strange thing called the machine. And here was a means, this strange thing, whether it was a steam engine or electricity or a 1 horsepower motor or whatever, of translating solar energy straight into production without human muscles being involved at all. This 1 horsepower motor would do the work of 10 men with wages, sweat, blood, tears, toil, tiredness, for a few pence a week in the form of energy. And you just imagine standing in the Industrial Revolution as the first machines that mankind had ever known came into existence, and looking forward into the future and trying to dream what society is going to come out of this. Is the day actually coming in the future when we're going to have, instead of men walking around a paddock behind a horse and a plow, we're actually going to have a machine that plants the wheat and harvests it? People would have said, that's mad. Don't be ridiculous. I saw the figures for the United States the other day. If they got all their wheat harvesters into one paddock, they could harvest the whole state of Iowa, which is 56,000 square miles, in a fraction under 24 hours. Staggering. Is the day coming when man no longer has to crawl down a hole in the ground with a pick and a shovel on his back and a bag with a lamplight to hack out a few minerals, put it in his bag and crawl his way up to the surface? We're actually going to have machines mining our minerals for us. Go and have a look at that Rundle thing they're developing in Queensland. We're going to bring into Australia, this is an awful thought, 3 machines that are so big that each machine wouldn't even sit on a football pitch. It has legs on it which are like massive, great 10-foot elephant trunks. And to pick one leg up, move it forward, put it down again, takes 44 gallons of fuel. Complete drum. And the bucket on the end of the arm, which just digs into the soil, you could put the whole Sydney Symphony Orchestra sitting in that bucket playing away at their instruments. And we're going to have 3 of those gulping away 24 hours a day. Is the day coming when we're actually going to see horses traveling along the roads without carriages pulling them? What's the biggest problem? Where to park the wretched things today. Isn't it? And then the most incredible question of all, is the day coming when man no longer really has to work? We need fewer and fewer people to produce the things that are needed. That we're moving into an age when that dreadful punishment of the Garden of Eden, by the sweat of your brow, a punishment from God, is going to be lifted off the backs of men. most incredible question of all is the day coming when man no longer really has to work. We need fewer and fewer people to produce the things that are needed. That we're moving into an age when that dreadful punishment of the Garden of Eden, by the sweat of your brow, a punishment from God, is going to be lifted off the backs of men. And that terrified the world, that thought. And instead of facing up to what was happening, when you think about it, the machine did the very opposite. The first machines that were built, instead of liberating people, were actually put into the cotton mills of Lancashire. And as the machines came in one side of the factory, the door at the other end opened and people just got the sack. They weren't needed. And they stumbled out into a new world where production was increasing and more people were starving because they hadn't got jobs. What we're talking about now, this huge unemployment, we've been smothering up for 200 years, you know. It's not something new. It's just got more and more intense. But it started then. The production of Britain rose and the starvation of Britain increased. Isn't it ridiculous? And workers scratched their heads and said, what's the answer? The answer is, let's get rid of the machine. So they had gangs, went round Britain in the dead of night with huge jackhammers, broke into the factories and tried to smash the machines to pieces. The Luddites. They couldn't hold it up. It was coming in so fast. There was an avalanche of technology. So the next development was much more frightening. There was a little man called Karl Marx sitting in Britain. That's where he was, in the middle of that industrial revolution, writing a book in the British Museum called the Communist Manifesto. And if you look at that book, it was written as a response to this new development. And he says it was not the machine that was to blame. It was ownership of the machine. And if we could produce a new scientific world where we got rid of all private property, how could one man exploit his brother? So let us build a revolutionary machine that will sweep the world and all the institutions that have shaped that previous world, including the Christian church. It's got to be broken by violence on the scrap heap of history and a new scientific age of equality put in its place. And you know, if you're starving, and you've got your kids working down, sloshing through the mines underground as they were in that industrial revolution. Little kids of 7 and 8, down thousands of feet in the darkness. Or your wives were working 16 hours a day for the price of bread. You know, you listen to anything. And that movement has now taken a third of the world, more than that. But it provides the thinking, the teaching, the learning in our part of the world. At every university, broadly, the economic teaching we're getting is one variety or another of Marxism. Sometimes unconsciously, sometimes quite consciously. But what was the Christian answer? The Christians said to those who were sloshing through the water, this world is a vale of tears. We're not meant to enjoy ourselves, you know. Just think about the world to come. But it's a bit tough to accept that if your kids are starving. And so we just blundered on economically, trying to fit into our economic system two totally impossible things. One said more and more and more technology. The second said full employment for everybody, and he who shall not work, neither shall he eat. The Christian was divided on this question himself. And if you're going to try and run an economic system with those two totally impossible things in it, you've only got one question to answer. What are you going to do with all the production? And you have to shape a certain type of economic system to keep the thing going. And that is an economic system that produces more and more and more, whether it is required or not. So we launched a technological attack on God's environment, which was really not husbandry at all. It was now destruction. We began to try and keep going by producing more and more and more. You look at technological societies that have played this game harder and longer than any other, and you see the most destructive. Communism is destructive, but look at capitalism. Look at the United States. It had to make economic units that produced more to survive. So in the space of 20 years, they shifted 16 million little farmers off the soil because they were told, now your farms are no longer producing enough. You've got to produce more to keep going. America was built around the Homestead Act, which was a Christian concept. Just a little bit of property for each family. That was gone. So you amalgamated farms together, and then you amalgamated those together again, and finally you produced something called an agribusiness, which was run more like a government department than a farm, and you had, on huge, great tracts of land, people with white coats walking around, and you had a department of chooks, and a department of cabbages, and a department of cows, and the whole thing's crashing now, because you can't run farms like that, and the little farm is coming back. But what a way to learn. And what happened to 16 million people, that's more than the whole population of Australia, just heaved out of one social economic environment and dumped down in another? Where did they go? They still had to live. They still had to have this thing called a job. So they went to the big cities, and the big cities, instead of being nice places, as they used to be, became awful. And in came a man called Whelan the Wrecker with a ball on the end of a chain, and he began to knock down the little suburban homes, and up in their places went high-rise flats. And you began to pack people into those like chooks into a chook pen. And we're doing this all over Sydney and Melbourne as though it's progress. What a way to bring up kids. You can't keep a puppy, you can't keep a kitten. Most of them you can't even keep a budgerigar. I heard of one not so long ago in Canada they forgot to put stairways in it. All they had were electric lifts. Family after family in tears. And if the power went off or you had a power strike, you were just trapped in your rat hole like a rat in a rat trap. Power went off in one area for 3 days. So they had a helicopter flapping up and down outside this building trying to throw sausages in through the windows. The ones we have in Melbourne and Sydney, we have 4 or 5 social workers now attached to each building simply because of the breakdown of the family in those conditions. Now, it wasn't terribly long ago. We had the Minister for Housing in the Soviet Union and shown round as a privileged guest over one block of flats in Melbourne. He said it was better than anything they had in Russia. And the very day he went round, some poor, wretched woman threw herself off the top of one building and committed suicide. They've had a number. She said, I can't take it any longer. Now, if somehow you can survive living in an environment like that, you come out down into the ant heap down below, and from Monday to Friday, there's a huge race trying to get this thing called a job. And away they go into industry if you're lucky enough to have a job in industry, and in industry there's only one problem: how do we get rid of this mountain of stuff that we're producing? We've got machines now which at the touch of a button can produce in minutes what it took days to produce a few years ago. So we begin to devise totally destructive ways of shifting it. First thing is export it. Export it, export or die. And the whole world is caught up in exports, except for one group, the communists. They say, you send all your exports to us. We don't want to export back at you. We'll just live off your Western production. We've fed them, we've clothed them, we've armed them. We'll put their factories in place. And now we shiver in front of the armies and navies, which we've built for them. Do you know that 4/5 of the ships in the Soviet Navy, which straddles the whole world, has turbines and diesels manufactured in the West? Well, exports can only take us so far. So the next question is, force your own people to consume more. So we devised the most brilliant brainwashing technique in the world called advertising. Instead of being a service telling you what's available, it's now a pressure to make people conform, and it hits you every 5 minutes over your television. We take it now for granted, but just sit and listen to it one day. It's brilliant, you know. Something washes whiter than white. Now, what does that mean when you think about it? All go and live in Marlborough country, and you see great bronzed heroes riding horses across the boundless plains. I think half of them have lung cancer, probably. The other half are being amalgamated and moved off. And then, you see, if that doesn't serve the purpose, and it did for a while, we developed one further technique. The only way we can keep our society going is to start making things that'll break down quicker and quicker. I don't know if you've noticed this. It is a science taught at university now. It's not just haphazard. And if you want to get a picture of this, get a book called The Waste Makers by Vance Packard. He's a socialist. His conclusion is wrong, but his description of the problem is 100%. He just went through one industry after another in the United States and painted a picture of what was happening. One I can think of, tires on cars. There was a little firm, absolutely broke, desperate, didn't know how to survive, trying to appease the bank manager. They had a board meeting and they said, well, look, let's look at the tires. The tires were lasting 20,000 miles on the average car. Let's make a whole new batch that only lasts 10,000 miles. So they did. And the dreadful thing is, it solved their problem. They sold more tires, you see. Bigger profits, black figures instead of red figures, happy bank manager, everybody smiling, more jobs. And in that microcosm is how we're running the Western world. And so America or Canada today, the main feature are huge areas of slag heaps of motor cars, washing machines, microwave ovens, fridges, nothing's ever repaired, piled, sometimes covering tens of thousands of acres, 4 or 5 deep. And that is, so long as we keep building those, perhaps we can keep the thing going. And even that now is running out. And so now we're finally getting factories where you don't have people working. I saw a picture of one the other day. It was a photograph where the factory was so big you couldn't see the end of it. It was just bank after bank after bank of machines producing shirts. And you went into the office, and there on a board was a program set up, all computerized, and you could work out how many shirts, how many colors, how many sizes, how many buttonholes, how many buttons, whether it was short sleeves or long sleeves, and you just pressed those buttons, and you went round 2 hours later to the other end of the factory, and you just picked up what you wanted, all in boxes, all with plastic covers, so many of each, and there wasn't one person working in that factory. It even swept the floor itself. I saw another picture of a factory producing pistons, exactly the same. To show how far we've gone, there was a seminar not very long ago on where we're going to take the industrial society, held in Florida. And they had politicians and economists, because this is a political problem just as much. We have now great armies of unemployed who are becoming revolutionary. You see, what are we going to do? And we had a paper given at that seminar quite seriously, which suggested the space program might give man a new breathing space. Not for the advantage of getting a man on the moon, but here is an unlimited export market out into space. We could keep everybody fully employed in factories, producing the things we need, put them in rockets, put a match to it, blast it out. And as this genius said, it has one major advantage. Nobody's going to import back at you. And they all pulled their notebooks out and made a note. Good thinking. And in order to keep this momentum going, America, which a few years ago they thought had inexhaustible raw materials, is now running out. It's gouging out into Canada, it's gouging out into the Middle East and Africa, it's gouging out into Australia, and it's taking bigger and bigger mountains of minerals and putting them in giant super tankers, which go faster than ever, consuming more fuel in the process across the ocean, feed it into this economic system so you can keep everybody fully employed, producing more things that'll break down quicker and quicker, so you can put them on rubbish heaps or send them out into the atmosphere, so you can keep everybody fully employed. And we've reached the end of the road. We can't keep it up any further. And look what we've done to God's heritage, to the stuff that he gave us for nothing, the very creation, to provide us our daily bread. And then we as Christians send our kids off into the educational system, which from the age of 5 and 6 onwards is doing assignments on pollution, destruction of the environment, and it's true, what we're doing to our rivers, our creek beds, what we're doing to people, what we're doing to streets. And the message coming through to those kids is that, kiddies, is capitalism or Western Christian civilization. And the answer to that is communism. We can't have freedom any longer. And because kids want something to believe in, and are idealistic, we wonder why they come out of those educational systems and stream off into radical movements. And if that isn't good enough, they go off into Eastern cults or drug problems, in desperation in a world that is literally tearing their environment apart and now tearing them apart. What's the Christian answer? And you go still to the churches, and the churches say, well, this world is a vale of tears, you know. It's not our job to provide answers in that field. And yet it's God's environment. Give us this day our daily bread. He's given us the means to produce our daily bread, and look what we're doing with it. And yet somewhere in the seed of this frightful destruction, it's a sin past any description, is also the seed of a greater abundance and freedom and love than ever before in mankind's history. If we get back on the way he's given us, life more abundant. And if we can discover the way to utilize this so that it returns to the individual freedom, what a world it could be. But we're not going to discover it through economic systems pouring out of Flinders University. It's got to come through individuals rediscovering the way that God wants us to live. God has economic answers. He's got answers for our economic system, our money system, our political system, our tax system, the way we use the environment, and we dare not turn away and shut our eyes and say this has nothing to do with us. Surely. And thank God the church is beginning to wake up and is beginning to see that. We are responsible. We do have to have an answer. What is the answer? There's a key in this, you know. And the key is this. Every time man discovers a means of creating more and producing more, not creating more, but producing more of the things that are needed, so that we have mountains now around the world, with less effort than ever before, are the costs of production going up or are they going down? And surely you'd have to argue they're going down. The costs of the man who spent a whole day walking around a paddock to get 1 acre of wheat in are 10 times as great as the 10 minutes we take to do that acre a day. What we should be getting as a result of all this, right through the progress of human history, as we've discovered the right sequence of laws, is a cost structure that is gradually coming down the whole time. Our goods should be getting cheaper. Let me give you one example. At the end of the war, to get a motor car off an endless belt took 1,100 man-hours. That's 1,100 men working for an hour. The Holden, the Commodore, now comes off in a fraction under 20 man-hours. It's the same material, but it's a fraction of the human effort. Should that Holden be more expensive or cheaper? Cheaper. There's a little story that illustrates this. Now, I just ask you to consider what sort of environment would Australia be if we just got one thing through, without any new laws, new governments, new anything else. All of a sudden, the Australia that we're living in, you began to find prices dropping. Not our returns and our incomes, but costs coming down. Our taxes, our electricity, the food that we buy, the essentials that we need, gradually coming down. For a very short while, I think we'd glut ourselves. This happened when they took sweet rationing off in Britain at the end of the war. They took it off, and everybody bought Mars bars until they were sick of them. I think it took about a month. And then they discovered in the second month they were eating less Mars bars than they were even when rationing was on. It was a funny thing. People got straight again. So there's going to be that for a while. But then, what would happen to people? And I put it to you that a number of things would happen. That little farm would be able to stay there. Instead of a new phrase ringing through the country, get big or get out, which every farmer dreads and fears, there might even be a new slogan, why not get a little bit smaller? The corner store would come back. Wives who genuinely wanted to, there'd be no force, could drop out of the workforce. Many daren't do it today and be with their kids. Husbands might genuinely take 2 or 3 months holiday each year. You could afford to do it. There was a time we used to do this in Australia. I bet a community up in Queensland not long ago, the whole district took 3 months off to build a hall. You wouldn't dare be able to afford to do that today. Parents could communicate with kids. People could retire earlier, which would open up new opportunities for those who wanted to get into the workforce, who at the moment are totally denied. There's no path through for them. Homes would become available to young people who want to get married. Interest rates would come down. Isn't that the sort of world we'd have time to speak to each other? We're running most of the time now. And sit down and have those community things we used to do, not just in the church, but the 101 other ways we used to live. Go round and look at the Australia of the 1920s and look how many things were done simply, not by government handouts, but people getting together and building the local hall or making a tennis court or doing those sort of things. That's what ought to be happening. Why then is it not being done? There's a little story illustrates this. It's the story of a man who was washed up on a desert island. I do apologize for island stories, but they're often the best way of getting it through. And he was the only survivor. The ship had gone down, and in the middle of this island, there were some coconut trees, and his one chance of life was to get some coconut down. So in the morning, he was pretty unfit, tried to climb up a coconut tree, took half the skin off his knees, got up to the top eventually, hooked an arm round, and knocked down a coconut. Plop. Slid down the tree, took all the skin off the other knee, got down to the bottom, ate that coconut. And that gave him the strength the next day to repeat the process. And so he had a little cycle going on the island. Every day his production was a coconut. Every day his consumption was a coconut. If you wanted to work out cost of production, you'd have to say it was one coconut over one coconut, wasn't it? Say if this is a bit too complicated. Then one day he learnt the knack. He was getting fitter. He'd learned how to climb, climbed up that tree, hooked his arm round, and down came 4 coconuts. Slid down the tree, and now he was faced with a bewildering array of choices. Either he could be an absolute pig and eat 4, or else he could have 3 days off. But what was cost of production now? Surely it was 1 coconut over 4. It's a quarter of what it had been before. Every time we discover a new way of using God's creation beneficially, things should be getting easier and not more difficult. I tell you that story because I saw this school run by Eric up in Toowoomba a few years ago, and we had 3 economists from the Darling Downs Institute of Advanced Education in the audience. And that they finished when they got to that story. They went right down the back of the hall and they sat round a little table with a pencil and paper. 1 coconut over 4. And when the school had finished, one came up and said to Eric, I'll never forget it. He said, where's the trick? He said, there must be a catch. It's one of these trick questions. But he said, honestly, if that's right, he said, if we can't work it out, he said, that blows every economic theory we've got sky high. Well, I'll tell you, God's creation does blow every man-made economic theory sky high. So we've got to discover this, because locked into this destruction is the very small seed of a breakthrough into a society that you can hardly imagine.